All right, in this lecture, I'm going to be showing you guys how to paint chrome, or really any sort of polished metal. It could be polished steel, anything that has extremely high specularity or high shine to it. So we're going to use this breastplate as an example, and we're going to use this also for when we do a little bit rougher metal, the steel, and then iron or really, really rough metal. Okay, so some things to keep in mind. For this example, we're imagining that the environment is sort of like possibly a forest area, some trees and some foreground elements and a sky, but depending on what your environment is, that will change. So you don't want to just copy this no matter what your character is in or whatever the object is in. If the surrounding is a desert, then you're going to need to paint the reflections like a desert. If it's inside of a building, you're going to need to paint the reflections like the inside of the room it's in. So just keep that in mind. But the rules that you're going to want to follow really quick before we get painting, I'll go ahead and make a new layer here so you can see, is that it's going to, the closer that it gets to the outside edge, the more distorted and skewed it's going to get, right? So if it's facing the viewer most directly, like this area right here is the closest to facing the viewer, it's going to be the least distortion, while these areas along the sides, as it turns away from the viewer, it's really going to squish, and it's going to get more and more extreme the farther away it gets. Same with this part in the middle here. As it turns away and creates that fold, the distortion gets much more extreme. Okay, so you want to keep that in mind as you're painting. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started. We have our line art on one layer and then a base shape layer down here, and then pretty much the entire painting is going to go on one layer for this, and that's typically how I like to paint metal. So I'm going to start out with, let's start with the sky on this one. So I'm just going to be color picking from the one I did earlier. You can do that as well, or you can pick your own colors or find a reference photo that you want to paint the reflection of. It's totally up to you. So I'm going to go ahead and select this shape layer beneath so I'm not painting outside my lines. And for this whole entire thing, I'm actually just going to be using the round brush. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated, just very simple. And yeah, I'm going to start by just coming in here and painting this in. And you're wanting this to be pretty crisp and pretty clean. There's not going to be a bunch of crazy texture going on, because this is really supposed to be a pretty clear, pretty clean, accurate representation or reflection of whatever's going on around. So keep that in mind. If you wanted to do scratches and dings in the polished metal, you can, but for this I'm going to really try to make it look as crisp and clean as I can. Okay, so just going to be painting in the whole sky, and as you go you'll be able to refine this more and more, but I'm just going to get down a lot of my base colors here. You can see that there's very slightly varying hues of blue and purple and slight greenish colors, even a little bit of a warmer gray. And all these are going to be mixing together to create that sky element. So let's say that you were painting, the setting that this was going to be in would be at sunset. Then instead of blues, you would be doing sunset colors, right? Purples, oranges, pinks, stuff like that. So just make sure that when you're painting, you're thinking about what's going on. You're not just guessing. Painting is really a problem-solving sort of endeavor, and it's never just as simple and formulaic as doing the same thing every time. You really got to consider the environment, what's going on around the object, because the reflected light that's bouncing off of things is always going to affect the object that you're painting. And the more conscious you can be about that, the better your painting will turn out, because a big something that really sets apart an amateur from a professional is that they don't guess. Professional doesn't guess about where things go, what the lighting is. A lot of times they make an informed decision about it, and sometimes it can be almost instinctive because of how often they've done it, but it's because they've learned through study, practice, and observation so that they don't have to guess anymore. So if you're not sure, take a moment, look at some reference photos, puzzle it out in your head, see if you can figure out where things are supposed to go. But you don't need to just randomly place stuff down. That will always show through in your work, and it's gonna look amateurish. And I know I say this all the time. If you take a lot of my courses or watch my YouTube videos, then you've probably heard me say this a billion times, and you're probably getting annoyed with it by now. But it's so true. And I mean, no matter how many times I say it, I still see people do the exact same thing that I'm talking about, which is just kind of guess where things go. So it's important, I think, enough to repeat a couple times. Alright, well that looks pretty good for the sky for now. Let's come over and do the this tree line sort of shape here. And like I said, I'm keeping this, it's going to be fairly crisp, so I don't want to have a ton of blurry lines. We want mostly hard edges for this tree line. Okay. Like I said, like I mentioned before, the farther that it gets away from the viewer, the more it wraps around the object, the more distorted it's going to become. Going a little bit quick here so that we can get it all in and not take an hour on this, but you can take as much time as you want to really render this and make it look I mean, if you're really up close, if the object is going to be really close to the viewer and that's kind of the focal point, then you're really going to want to make sure that you get the reflections of the environment in there really well, and that it looks crisp and clear. If it's going to be a little bit farther away from the viewer, then you can get a little bit more suggestive with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It can just sort of suggest what's there and what that sort of lighting environment is like. It doesn't have to be a perfect replication of everything in the scene. All right. And then I'm going to go ahead, there's some almost black in here. It's a really, really dark green. We're going to put that in as well in the center of this tree line where it gets really dark in there. And you don't, I mean, you're not just painting flat trees, right? They're going to be distorted by the warping of the metal. Okay. And if you want to, you can use a smudge tool to help move this around a little bit. I personally don't. You can, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not my painting style. But that is an option. Just be careful not to, I've seen it before where it can tend to start to look really tacky and really bad, sort of have an amateurish quality to it. So just make sure you don't go overboard, that you're controlling your brush and it's not getting away from you if you're going to do that. Alright, so then I picked a little bit lighter green that's just going to go right along the top edge here of this tree line. That's the closest to the sky where it would be getting lit the most. Okay, get some of this white sky in here. There we go. I'm going to, before we go any further, I'm just going to take care of this. Let's do the inside of the armor. It's just going to be a really dark gray, almost black, but not quite. And then same thing for the shoulder pieces. And then we'll put a little bit of a gradation there as well, a little hint of light in the bottom part. So we'll grab that gray over here, use that to fill in the bottom. All right, let's move on. I'm gonna darken that up just a little bit really quick. Okay, let's move on to this ground down here. You can see that there's a few different colors going on in this brown area, and that's just to break it up, give it a little bit more visual interest. Now, remember when we did the glossy paint that that there was some of the paint color beneath showing through, as well as some of the shading of the form of that object, right? We did that layer where we treat it as if it was a matte object. Well, in this, we're not really doing that because it's perfectly reflecting everything around it. So you're not even really going to see a lot of that, a lot of that form. It's just going to reflect everything in its environment perfectly, albeit warped, but besides that, all the values and the colors are just going to be a representation of what's around it. So for example, I'll show you here in a second when we get to it. Let's just finish doing this ground here really quick. You can see here on the bottom, it's reflecting closer to the ground where maybe there's a shadow being cast of the armor itself, and so it gets pretty dark down there. But that's not really a shadow. It's not like the form shadow of the armor. It's simply a reflection of the ground that has a shadow being cast onto it, if that makes sense. All right. Come along pretty nicely here. Let's go ahead and do these sides where it's warped so much that it's wrapped around again and is reflecting parts of the sky. Okay. And then get this gray color down here. And I'm going to grab this white again. Let's come back in here and brighten up this area a bit. All right, excellent. Now we can do the collar here. So I'm going to pick this bluish color, the collar and the where the arms come out. And it will kind of fade away down there as we get to the bottom with a little bit of a light pickup there at the bottom. Do the same thing with the other side. And then same thing up top. there along the back, and then we'll get this white down here. This is going to be up here at the top where it's really picking up that light, and then as well as right here along in the middle. And then we'll get a little bit of this blue here that will kind of come along from the edges right up here. All right, excellent. And then let's see, a few more things. Let's get this darker green, not the black, but just a really dark green to bring in kind of the bottom edge of this rounded piece of metal that makes up the collar. This will be sort of reflecting down more towards that tree line instead of the sky. All right, there you have it. That is our reflective metal, whether it's chrome or just really polished steel. That's going to be how you go about it. Once again, it's going to depend on the form of the object, on how it's being warped, and the environment and the surrounding on what you're actually going to be painting all in there. But that's how I would go about painting it in this scenario. And just remember that the farther it gets away from the viewer, the more it wraps around the object, the more warped it's going to be. And the closer that it's facing us directly, the more it's parallel with our vision, the less warped it's going to be. So that's it for this lecture. I'll see you guys in the next one.